So, welcome everyone to our next Institute for Northern Studies research seminars, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Brian Smith, who is well known to, I think I can see the names in the attendees, so well known to everyone in the attendees list and well known in the realms of academia and studies of Shetland, and he's also a research fellow with the Institute for Northern Studies, and we've been hoping to have him speak to us for quite a while, so it's really quite exciting that Brian is available this evening, and he's going to be talking about an exciting subject. So, Shetland and the Sagas, invisible or hidden. So, I won't hold this up because we want to get into this subject as soon as possible. So, welcome, Brian. It's great to see you.
Well, thanks, Andrew, for inviting me. I'll get right into it. I'm starting on St Magnus Day in 1914, when the Orkney scholar Alfred W. Johnston gave a presidential address to the Viking Society in London. His subject was Orkney and Shetland folk, 872 to 1350. He spoke at length about Orcadian potentates, as the compiler of Orkneyinga Saga had done. Johnston's remarks about the Shetlanders, on the other hand, were scant. Notices of Shetland in the saga, he said, are to all intents and purposes nil. And he didn't leave it at that. Shetlanders, he went on, presumably forgetting that there might be one or two in the audience, pride themselves in their geographic detachment from Orkney with its Scottish people and customs, and claim to be regarded as purer Norsemen. Perhaps it is owing to this humdrum purity that the Shetlanders did not achieve any deeds of sufficient interest to be recorded in the saga. And he concluded with an even more spectacular jibe. There was no necessity, he advised, for a genuine Norse Islander to crow himself hoarse on his native rock, and to do so would indicate that there were grave doubts as to the purity of his strain. Purity of strain was crucial in Johnston's investigation. He invoked what he called the rules of a modern breeding society in his account. Earl Ronald Cally Coulson, he revealed, was 115 128ths Norse and 13 128ths Gael in descent. Now, I needn't say that these ideas are fatuous and do not help us to understand our subject tonight. It's worth contrasting Johnston's approach with that of his fellow Orcadian Joseph Storer Clouston. Clouston's account is sober. In his great History of Orkney, published in 1932, he says that Shetland is so seldom mentioned in the Orkneyinga Saga, and I quote, that one is quite at a loss to know what importance it had and what part it played. That was a reasonable matter to raise, because references to Shetland in that saga are, at first sight, few. But Clouston's tentative answer isn't convincing. He approaches it from an exclusively Orcadian point of view. The Earls of Orkney, he began, were overlords of Shetland, but they visited it very seldom. How then was it directly governed? His conclusion is that the Earl's authority, I quote again, was represented in Shetland by only a very few chiefs, the Godings that we read about in Orkneyinga Saga. It would appear then, he concluded, that Shetland was a remarkably independent dependency, for practical purposes ruled by a few powerful chieftains under the Orkney Earls. I mentioned these views at the outset of my paper tonight, Johnston's ravings, Clouston's measured remarks, with a view to going in an entirely different direction. Clouston's proposition that the earls based in Orkney had a firm grasp on Shetland, assisted by a small number of chieftains, is unconvincing. The situation is likely to have been more complicated than that. And finally, we must face the key problem that sagas and other early sources do not and cannot deal with key questions about societies that historians would like to answer. I begin with two sources from the 12th century, one Irish, one Norwegian. Properly read, they may tell us useful things about Shetland at an early date. That is despite the fact that none of them refers explicitly to Shetland. My first source is called the Kogad, an Irish text written down at the beginning of the 12th century. It contains a passage where Earl Sigurd Hlodvisson of Orkney is said to arrive in Ireland to fight at the Battle of Clontarf. He has with him an army of ignorant, barbarous, thoughtless, irreclaimable, unsociable foreigners from Insi Ork and Insi Cat. Some scholars have argued, sometimes with caution, that Insi Cat, coming as it does immediately after what is undoubtedly Orkney, might refer to Shetland. That has led to an even more dubious argument that the element cat in the name was the original form of Hjalt in the name Hjaltland or Hjaltland. According to this view, pre-Norse Shetland was the home of a tribe called the Cats. But the more I look at Insi Cat, the more I have serious doubts about both propositions. I'm inclined to agree with the scholar William Forbes Skene that it may be an attempt to write Caithness. There were cats in Caithness, of course, but there's very little likelihood that they were in Shetland too. That doesn't mean that the passage is irrelevant to my subject tonight. Alec Wolff has shown that such Irish passages are the first secure references that we have to an Earl of Orkney. If Shetland doesn't feature explicitly, as it doesn't in many saga references to Orkney, that isn't to say that it isn't implied. There may well have been Shetlanders in Sigurd's retinue. A very good parallel example is in the source, again from the 12th century, called Historia Norvegiae. Probably written by a Norwegian ecclesiastic, it contains a chapter De Orcadibus Insulis about the Orkney Islands. The author claims that in the days of Harald Fairhair, King of Norway, certain pirates of the family of the most vigorous Prince Ronald set out with a great fleet and crossed the Solundic Sea and stripped the native races there of their ancient settlements, destroyed them wholly, and subdued the islands to themselves. The passage refers to the Orkney earldom, which incorporated Shetland. Earl Sigurd oversaw both groups of islands. Historia Norvegiae is important in hinting at what might have happened to the pre-Norse inhabitants of Shetland and Orkney in the 9th century, just as Kogad gives us our first reliable portrait of an Orkney earl and his followers, perhaps including his Shetland followers 200 years later. I'm going to say a lot about Orkneyinga Saga, our key work about Orkney and Shetland, from Earl Sigurd's death in 1014 up till about 1250. It is, of course, unwise to assume that a saga text, especially one that commences with events in the 9th century, half a millennium before it was written, is a reliable account. Storer Clouston believed every word of it. But Alec Wolff has warned us that we need contemporary documents if we are to write good history. And Tom Fairfax, that material in the Orkney Saga that deals with the period before 1150 is especially suspect. Most of what I'll say tonight is about that early period, an era when we have hardly any contemporary documents at all. Scholars have been examining Orkneyinga Saga since the Icelander Arngrimur Johnston wrote a long epitome of it in the 1590s. Arngrimur was the first to spot that, as he put it, Hetlandia semper Orcadum nomine complectimur, that in the saga Shetland is often included under the name Orkney. Readers of the saga, especially the Penguin edition of it, should beware of regarding it as a rounded narrative, as a sort of novel. It's a compilation of sources which are radically different from each other. Its first scholarly editor, Gudbrandur Vigfusson, usefully divided it into three main sections: the so-called Jarl Saga, dealing with the sons of Earl Sigurd and their disputes; the story of Earl Magnus and the miracles which happened after his death; and a long adventure tale about Earl Ronald, the longest part of the whole. If we proceed carefully, we may discern in each of these segments evidence about the special part that Shetland might have played in the affairs of the Orkney earldom. In the first part, we read about quarrels between Brucey Sigurdsson and his son Ronald, Brucey's brother Einar, and his half-brother Thorfinn Sigurdsson. They were all Earls of Orkney. The account of these events, especially the first part of them, has a literary style different from anything else in the saga. A.B. Taylor says that it is eminently clear and logical, and that its diction possesses a certain legal quality. As part of his lawyerly inquiry, the writer is at pains to discuss how the brothers divided the Orkney earldom between them in thirds and halves from time to time, and how the various earls operated and disputed with each other in the different parts of their domain. Storer Clouston thought that he had solved all the problems about these complex events. Writing in 1918, he pictured the earls as so many King Lears, brandishing a map, or at least a tax register, computing the value of Orkney townships and assigning equal parts of the realm to each other every now and again. Clouston was convinced that the earls only divided Orkney. Shetland, he said carelessly, presumably was divided, but it is only of Orkney that we have any particulars. Clouston's view was that the earls used the valuation of Orkney into ouncelands and pennylands, units recorded in documents of the 15th and 16th centuries, to facilitate the partition. He overlooked the fact that there's no evidence or likelihood that these units were in existence in the 11th century. They almost certainly were not. Orcadians and Shetlanders undoubtedly paid tax at that early date, but in Norway there's likely to have been a rough and ready taxation system rather than anything more precise. And it's likely that the earldom divisions described in the saga were rough and ready too. We know that the protagonists had interests in Caithness, Orkney, and Shetland. If they went in for a tripartite division, it's possible that these three were the components of it. But can we go on to pinpoint who was operating where? There are some potential clues. In chapter 22 of the saga, we learn that Earl Brucey had the northernmost part of the islands and was then there. The word islands, Aya, which appears again and again in this part of the saga, is crucial. Clouston assumed that it meant Orkney exclusively, and others have done the same. So Clouston imagined that Bruce's lot was the North Isles of Orkney. I suggest, on the other hand, that that northmost lot might have been Shetland, and that Brucey might have been ensconced there. According to the saga, he was a peaceful sort of character, different from his brothers. Their different policies affected conditions in their separate parts of the domain. In chapter 14, we learn that there arose great scarcity in the islands on account of the labour and large expense to which the peasantry were subjected by Earl Einar, but that in the parts of the land belonging to Brucey, there were good seasons and easy life, and he was greatly liked. That sounds to me as if Brucey and his brother controlled widely separate parts of the earldom, not adjacent districts of Orkney. I've speculated from time to time if Brucey might have been based in Bressa in Shetland, which features as Brucei in a document of 1490. It's by far the biggest island in Shetland, named after an individual. It's worth looking closely at the verses in this part of Orkneyinga Saga, which of course are far older than the main text. They may incorporate material that throws light on my Shetland theme. The skald Otter the Black wrote a verse about King Olaf of Norway. According to the saga, Earl Brucey and later Earl Thorfinn had travelled east to consult Olaf about their disputes. The result of their consultations was that the king confirmed Brucey in his possession of a third of the earldom, conferred a second third on Thorfinn, and retained the third part himself. In the saga, Olaf becomes lyrical about these new arrangements, and so did Otter. I will now make publicly known the treaty between me and the Earls of the Orkneys, Olaf said. They have acknowledged my suzerainty over all the Orkneys and Shetland, promising to become my men, and confirming these their promises with oaths. Otter was even more cheerful. He addresses the king. Thou hast the sway of an overlord or emperor. The Shetlanders are now acknowledged thy subjects. Not until now, he went on, was there a king in the east that had subdued the western islands under him. Clouston's fond belief that only Orkney could have been involved in such negotiations is contradicted by the saga and by the skald. A quarter of a century later, Brucey's son Ronald fought a pitched battle with Thorfinn at Robury in Orkney. Another skald, Arnar, watched the battle. He mourned that both these Orkney earls were at odds with each other. Ronald was defeated. Prince Ronald, Arnar wrote, would have won all the ancient land for himself if he had had the help of the islanders. The people betrayed the Lord of the Shetlanders. That phrase, Lord of the Shetlanders, and variants of it, appears in several poetic sources. After Ronald's death, Thorfinn became undisputed ruler of the whole earldom. Writing at the end of Thorfinn's career, Arnar calls him the Lord of Shetland, doughtiest of men who gained every battle. I've wondered sometimes if this phrase resembles, or even maybe the same as the title Lord of Shetland bestowed on noblemen like Earl Patrick Stewart in later centuries. At any rate, it shows that Shetland was a special part of the Orkney earldom, as we might expect by now. When he died, Earl Thorfinn left two heirs, Paul and Erland. Can we find any connection between either of them and Shetland? We can. In the old text called the Legenda de Sancto Magno, we read about how Magnus, Erland's son, was with his father in Shetland. It's worth asking if they might have had estates there centred on the island of Papa Stoer. Papa features as St Magnus Isle in a document of 1563, and it's adjacent to the extensive stretch of water called St Magnus Bay in modern times. Once we find Magnus and his cousin active in the vicinity in Orkneyinga Saga and longer and shorter Magnus Sagas, they are said to have burnt a famous man called Thorbjorn in his house at Burrowfirth, perhaps West Burrowfirth in Aithsting. Equally important from our point of view is a passage in the longer Magnus Saga about an agreement between Magnus and Haakon to share the earldom. At last this matter, by the intervention of good men, was so settled that the earldom of the Orkneys, Caithness and Shetland should be equally divided between Earls Magnus and Haakon. Neither of them was to attack the other's realm with any greed. So Clouston's notion that such divisions involved Orkney alone turns out again to be false. It's when Magnus dies in well-known circumstances that his close connection with Shetland becomes clearest. The three sagas contain details of no fewer than 10 named Shetlanders who travelled south to his tomb in Orkney. There was Bergfinn Skatterson, who was blind. He went to Orkney twice, the second time with his son Halfdan, a leper. Bergfinn got back his sight, and Halfdan was made thoroughly whole. Bergfinn was also accompanied by two cripples, Thorbjorn and Sigurd, both of whom stood straight up at Magnus's tomb. On another occasion, back at home, Bergfinn rebuked his tenant Thord for working on St Magnus Day, and when Thord went mad because of his impious behaviour, Bergfinn vowed to give half a mark of silver at Magnus's shrine. Thord became whole on that night, on the evening of which the vow had just been made. These events, alleged events culled from a miracle book, are entirely different from anything in the first and third parts of Orkneyinga Saga. The saga as a whole is about potentates. Of course, Bergfinn Skatterson was one of them, but he had plebeian neighbours, and we hear about them as well. From the little information we have about him, we see that he was an important Shetlander who regarded himself as a Shetland representative of the late Earl. I wonder if he lived at Berfensetter in Delting in Shetland, where there's a tradition of a judicial site, and even if his father gave his name to Skatsta in the same parish. But the other Shetlanders healed at Magnus's shrine were ordinary men and women. In some cases, we have their Shetland addresses: Sigurd Tandrason at Dell, whose hand was cramped, and Sigrid of Ballastay and Unst, who sewed when others left off work on St Magnus Eve, and like Thord went crazy. Fragments like these don't tell us all the things we want to know about the Orkney earldom in the 11th century. They don't even make clear exactly what part Shetland and Shetlanders played in the polity although they provide tantalizing glimpses. Perhaps the third part of Orkneyinga Saga, the part about Ronald Cully Colson, will provide us with more insights. Ronald was the great-grandson of Earl Thorfinn and nephew of St Magnus. Not surprisingly, we find that he too had Shetland connections as part of the Erland line of Jarls. And just as Magnus was at odds with his cousin Haakon, who killed him, Ronald was the rival of Haakon's son Paul. We now begin to see how the Shetland part of the earldom might have operated vis-à-vis Orkney. From now on, references to Shetland are explicit rather than concealed. It's not the case, as Storer Clouston believed, that earls based in Orkney controlled Shetland through the agency of chieftains there. Much of the time, there were earls based in Shetland with their own following pitted against their Orkney relatives, except on occasions when Orcadians like Thorfinn in his latter days possessed the whole earldom. In the past, I've called the Shetland earls, men such as Brucey, Ronald Bruceson, St Magnus, and now Ronald Cully Colson, outsiders whose aim, like the Orcadians, was to possess the whole earldom. I call them outsiders because they had fewer resources than their Orkney cousins, and they were miles away from the central Orcadian part of the whole that they coveted. In the 56th chapter of the saga, we find a list of Earl Paul's chieftains, his goadings, planted in every part of Orkney. They were members of the Orkney Earls family. Very significantly, as we'll see, the northmost of them was Dagfinn Hlodverson, who lived in Fair Isle. His rare surname, the same as Earl Sigurd's back in the 10th century, shows that yet again he was from Earl stock. That disposes of Clouston's argument, borrowed from the Norwegian historian Alexander Bugge, that there were few of the Earl's goadings in Shetland, but that those in Shetland were active on the Earl's behalf. In fact, there seemed to have been no Shetland goadings at all in the strict sense of the word. It was an institution maintained by Earls in Orkney alone. Ronald Cully Colson and his cousin Paul were joint claimants to the earldom. When Ronald came to manhood, Paul was already in charge in Orkney. Sometime around 1135, Ronald, based then on his mother's estates in Norway, sailed to Shetland with 5 or 6 ships. At midsummer, they arrived in Gjelsund. They went a-feasting over the country, according to the saga, for the inhabitants received them well. It's worth looking more closely at the word for feasting, for entertainment in that passage, vidsla. It may not just imply that Ronald got a good welcome from the Shetlanders whom he met. The word may suggest that the Shetlanders gave him a formal welcome because of his status as an earl. Earl Paul knew exactly what Ronald's intentions were, to use his Shetland earldom base for an onslaught on Orkney. I think it would be unworthy, Paul said to his followers, to flee from my lands without a trial of strength. My counsel is to send men tonight to collect troops throughout all the islands, in this case throughout Orkney. In other words, he assembled his Orkney goadings for war. Paul and his men sailed to Shetland. They arrived in Gjelsund, and Paul challenged Ronald and his Shetland followers to a naval battle. Earl Paul, says the saga, didn't trust the Shetlanders, not surprisingly, since they'd assembled behind his earldom rivals. So he challenged them to a naval battle. But Ronald didn't dare oppose Paul at sea because there weren't enough warships in Shetland. Another piece of proof that there was no sophisticated goading organisation in the northmost part of the earldom. The skirmish petered out. Ronald sailed back to Norway. He discussed the affair with his father, Coll. Ronald said that the affair had brought little honour to himself. Coll replied, "I do not think so. I think a great deal has been done since the Shetlanders are your friends." Ronald had made contact successfully with his supporters in the Shetland part of the realm. Paul went back to Orkney. When he got there, he decreed that a beacon should be erected on the highest hill in Fair Isle, a signal if enemies started to come from Shetland. Just as Dagfinn was the northmost goading in Orkney, Fair Isle now became the northmost portion of Paul's Orcadian defences, with Dagfinn in charge. Back in Norway, prior to Ronald's next onslaught, Coll addressed a meeting of their followers. "It is my counsel," he said, "to seek for help where it is likely to be had effectually." Coll wasn't referring to a living ally. He had in mind St Magnus, Ronald's Shetland predecessor. "It is my wish," continued Coll, "that you should make a vow to him, that he may grant you your patrimony and his inheritance. You should promise one thing, that if you obtain those dominions, you will build a stone minster at Kirkwall in the Orkneys, dedicating it to your kinsman, Earl Magnus the Holy." Ronald then set off for Shetland again. He picked up his Shetland supporters and headed to Orkney. Coll's next stratagem came into play. It involved the beacon on Fair Isle. He sent one of Ronald's men, Uni, to the isle in a 6-oared boat with provisions and fishing tackle. Uni told the islanders that he was a Norwegian but was married in Shetland and had been robbed by Earl Ronald's men there. The tale that he told is significant. It looks as if he could be certain that the Fair Islanders wouldn't recognise him. In other words, the island at that stage was part of Orkney. That needn't surprise us, given that one of Paul's chieftains was in charge there. Uni persuaded the islanders to put him in charge of the Fair Isle beacon, as he said that he had nothing else to do. He doused it with water, and when Ronald headed for Orkney, it was impossible for Paul's men to forestall them. But after all the excitement, things resolved themselves in Ronald's favour. He arrived in Orkney, and soon afterwards Paul disappeared from the islands forever. For the rest of his life, Ronald shared the earldom with his younger cousin, Harold Madadderson. As far as the division of the earldom is concerned, from then on, and the part that Shetland played in the process are concerned, we don't find much information in Orkneyinga Saga. In its final third, it becomes largely an account of Earl Ronald and the Orkney Viking Sven Asleifsson. There are few references to Shetland in the final part of the text. If I were to hazard a guess, I suggest that Earl Harold might have had more to do with Shetland in that period, since he was the junior partner in the arrangement with Ronald. We find his men collecting tax in Shetland at one point. Ronald, meanwhile, devoted his attention to Orkney and Caithness. He died in Caithness in the late 1150s. There is, however, one final section in Orkneyinga Saga where we find Ronald active in Shetland, this time as the result of an accident. On his way home from Norway to Orkney around 1148, he was shipwrecked in Shetland. That part of the saga contains a delicious account of the occasion when Ronald went to Sombra dressed in a white cowl and cloak. The event is recounted in a manuscript fragment that Gudbrand Vigfusson unearthed in Uppsala in 1874. Since its discovery, it has been popular in Shetland. It's arguably the most vivid part of this whole saga. I make 2 points about these events at Sombra. First, the author of the fragment knew a great deal about the topography of that part of Shetland. Earl Ronald and the fishermen sail west from Sombra Head to Hundholm, the little isle just south of Scatness. It's now called Horsholm. They get stuck in the notorious roost or tide race there. The account of their route into danger is very convincing, perhaps the composition of someone who had been on the spot. My second point is that Ronald met ordinary Shetlanders at Sombra, an old fisherman with a large family at home and a crowd of poor people who assembled at the beach to get a share of his fish. As I said when I discussed the material about the pilgrims to St Magnus's shrine, such plebeian actors aren't typical of the saga as a whole. They certainly make the text richer. The episode of Earl Ronald, the fisherman and the hungry Shetlanders is the subject of a fine story by George Mackay Brown. The saga account is a realistic culmination to Orkneyinga Saga's sometimes cryptic treatment of Shetland. I turn now to the last days of Shetland's involvement in the Orkney earldom and its affairs, and the event which finally snapped the link between them. As I said, we needn't look to Orkneyinga Saga for evidence about that matter. The final pages of it are fragmentary and uninformative. Instead, we must consult the saga of King Sverri Sigurdsson. A late saga dealing with recent events may be more reliable and suggestive than a text like Orkneyinga Saga, even if, as in this case, it's a eulogy about its subject. Like Orkneyinga Saga, Sverri's saga is an account of relations between aristocrats. At one point, however, it contains a passage about something entirely different. It concerns a speech that King Sverri made in Bergen around 1186. We desire, he said, to thank the Englishmen who have come here, bringing wheat and honey, flour and cloth. We desire to thank those who have brought here linen or flax, wax or cauldrons. We desire next to make mention of those who have come from the Orkneys, Shetland, the Faroes or Iceland, all those who have brought here such things as make this land the richer, and we cannot do without. Mercantile activities by Shetlanders or anybody else isn't something that Orkneyinga Saga ever bothers to mention. But there's no doubt, as subsequent events show, that Shetlanders were bringing fish to Bergen and selling them to merchants there, and this is a very valuable early reference to that trade. There are, by the way, references to Shetland merchants in Sturlunga Saga, usually in Iceland, which historians have not noticed. I have in mind Erland Arshold, a Shetland brewer who was plying his trade at the Althing in Iceland around 1215, and another Shetlander, Undot, who was travelling around Iceland in the 1250s in pursuit of a debt. These references point to more far-ranging activities by Shetlanders than Orkneyinga Saga suggests. Orkneyinga Saga was probably compiled by an Icelander, but he had little or nothing to say about his native country. He was fixated on Orkney aristocrats. It's events of the 1190s that we must consider now. Once again, they're about aristocrats. There's an extremely detailed account of them in Sverri's saga. Olaf, a kinsman of Earl Harold Madaderson of Orkney, joined in a plot with others to depose the king. As a figurehead, the conspirators chose a boy called Sigurd, a son of King Magnus Erlingsson, whom Sverri had killed 10 years previously. Olaf took the boy to Shetland, where he had big estates. I even wonder if Olaf might have been a Shetlander, and he apparently had discussions about the forthcoming campaign when they were there. The following spring, Olaf and the other conspirators met in Orkney and told Earl Harold about their plan. Harold saw great merit in a campaign to depose Sverri and place the boy on an empty throne. Why? First of all, Harold had been a supporter of King Magnus. Also, it seems likely that he was scunnered about attempts by Sverri to strengthen his control of the provinces by appointing royal servants called sysselmen to operate in them. There had been no such officials in Orkney or Shetland previously, and Earl Harold didn't like the prospect. He didn't want encroachments on his power. So Harold gave the conspirators a longship and intimated that anyone who joined their expedition would have his support. A great number of Orcadians and Shetlanders signed up. They called themselves, or were called, the Earskeggjar, the Island Beards, presumably because they were noted for being hirsute. Note that word Eyar again. Storer Clouston, you recall, assumed that it always refers to Orkney, but on this occasion the saga makes it clear that both Shetland and Orkney are meant. Shetlanders played a key part in the revolt. The island beards sailed to Norway and began to cause havoc there. They held an assembly and proclaimed the boy Sigurd as king. I needn't follow the Shetlanders and Orcadians on their travels in Norway and Denmark and their successes. At first they did well. Eventually, however, they met the king in battle at Florvå, north of Bergen. Their clash there has been described as the deadliest naval struggle in the history of Norway. Olaf Erlskin and his fellow conspirators and the boy Sigurd died in the battle. But what's most important from our point of view tonight is the fallout from the rebellion. Earl Harold had made a bad decision in supporting it. In the summer of 1195, he and the Bishop of Orkney travelled to Norway to grovel at the king's feet. A meeting of all parties took place in the yard of Christkirk in Bergen, and Harold made his plea for forgiveness. I am now an old man, he addressed the observers, as you can see from my beard. He was another island beard. I have drawn near the knees of many kings, sometimes with affection and often in difficult circumstances. Now there is a new difficulty on my hands, the anger of my lord King Sverri. He began to make excuses. Less blame is mine in this business, he said, than is imputed to me. I did not plan the rising. It's true I did not fight against it, for I could not be hostile to all the people in the land as long as I should be earl over it. In other words, he was blaming the Orkney and Shetland conspirators whom he had aided. But there is no need to speak here long, as the thing has been done, he concluded. He addressed King Sverri, I commit all into God's hands and yours, sire. Sverre rebuked the hapless earl for causing great ravage when he raised so strong a force as the island beards to make war in the land. But the earl has now come here, he said. He repents of the offence he committed against us and begs for mercy. Mercy I will grant him, for I shall need from God greater mercy than I have deserved. Stand up, Lord Earl, and receive God's pardon and mine. I will declare the terms of peace between us at greater leisure. That scene in Bergen in 1195 was the climax of Shetland's relationship with Orkney in the earldom. First of all, Sverre seized the property of the island beards who had died in the battle. He set down in a scroll all the estates and possessions in Orkney and Shetland that they had possessed. My old friend Mortimer Manson hoped against hope that that important manuscript might someday come to light. I fear it never will. Sverre then fixed a period of 3 years during which the kinsmen of the dead could redeem their estates with money. If they failed to do so, the lands would fall to the king's treasury forever. Sverre left Orkney in Harold's hands with a caveat that the king would receive half of all the fines exacted in Orkney's law courts. He also appointed a royal bailiff, a sysselman in Orkney, the very thing that Harold had joined the rebellion to prevent. But Sverre's treatment of Shetland was more radical. He took Shetland under his own control, and it remained under the Norwegian kings for a quarter of a millennium. I wonder if that was because the Shetlanders, encouraged by Olaf, had been especially active in the revolt. Nothing was the same for Shetland when it split from Orkney. There were no more visits from outsider earls. Shetland received her own sysselman, Gregory Keeker. In 1223, Gregory appears with the Archdeacon of Shetland, perhaps another institutional innovation at a royal assembly in Bergen. At a stroke, communications between Shetland and Orkney became reduced to ecclesiastical ones. The Shetland Archdeacon became the president of the chapter of St Magnus Cathedral. Shetland's new secular world was entirely different. It looked east, not south. From the 1270s onwards, Shetland became subject to King Magnus Lawmender's all-encompassing law of the land. Virtually all the information in my paper about the period between the death of Sigurd Hlodvisson and the removal of Shetland from the earldom 250 years later derives from Icelandic sagas. There are hardly any contemporary documents. We must fall back on literary texts, sometimes written hundreds of years after the event. These sources don't deal with most of the subjects that a historian wants to explore, the relationship between classes, for instance, or the political economy of Orkney, far less Shetland. Those things are invisible. But given the composite nature of Orkneyinga Saga and its textual complexities, the picture of Shetland that I've extracted, not the compiler's main concern, to put it mildly, makes some sense. It deals with the special role that Shetland played in the earldom and how outsider earls used it as a base until the end of Shetland's political connection with Orkney. I hope that what I've said is a useful corrective to Alfred Johnston's racial fantasies and Storer Clouston's unduly Orcadian account. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Brian. Yes, that was an excellent comprehensive explanation of Shetland's special role within the the earldom, and it made it very clear. I wonder if there are any questions that people would like to bring up. And in fact, here we have one. I don't know if you can see the chat, Brian, but I can read it out to you. We've got a question here from Brian Tulloch, who says, my native island of Sandy, also appears very little in the Orkneyinga Saga for some reason. 16% of the Orkney penny lands were in Sandy, which implies it was highly taxed and hence highly populated compared to the remainder of Orkney in the Norse era. As a comparison, the island now only pays about 4% of local taxes. The largest entry relating to Sandy appears in the Flat Air book. Okay, it's not a question. It's just thank you very much, Brian. It's just a comment that part of Orkney as well didn't feature much in the saga, although it appears to have been important. So can just put that down to the way the Orkneyinga Saga was focusing on some areas and not so much in others. And there we go. There's Judith Jesh. She's got a comment as well. Many thanks, Brian. Excellent and thought-provoking survey. However, she wants to quibble a little bit, Brian. Earskegger are not island beards, but island men or even island dwellers, which actually fits your argument better. And she can explain a little bit more in more detail if you'd like at this point or later. So.
Well, I'd love to know more about that. I mean, just about everybody in the world has assumed that it meant island beards or beardies.
So I'll make it.
There's a very interesting entry.
There we go. There's Judith.
Oh, good.
Hello, Judith.
Judith.
Am I allowed to speak?
You are indeed.
Okay. I think that translation goes back to Sefton's translation of Sverris Saga, and it's frequently quoted by people. But if you look at Earldom Saga, there's a man in there called Thorolfur Mosterarskeg, who comes from the island of Moster in Norway. And if you look in the dictionaries, the word skeggi, which is a neuter noun, is not the same as skeggur, which is a masculine noun meaning beard. So it just means a man from a particular place. But I think that actually fits what you were saying better than going on about their beards, even though you might have an interest in the subject yourself.
I'm very interested to hear that, Judith. I rather think that Gudbrand in his dictionary is under the impression that it means beards. And he makes a bizarre comment to the effect that their being so called referred to the peculiar habits of people in the Northern Isles. But I understand what you say, and I'm very interested to hear it. But certainly, if Sefton was the inventor of that idea, it caught on because, my goodness, most people refer to them in that way.
Well, I think that there probably is an etymological connection, since there is a connection between men and beards. But I just think in that context, in a compound together with the first element, which refers to a place, I think it means dweller rather than beard.
I see. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Judith. There aren't. There's lots of comments thanking you, Brian, for a wonderful talk. It's a pity if you could find the chat yourself, you'd be able to see those.
I can see it, but it keeps flipping on, so to speak.
That's right. The next one comes up. That's right. Well, here we go. Here's there's a comment from Tom Fairfax. Thank you, Brian. It's brilliant. The phrase Lord of Shetlanders in the Skaldic poetry is particularly interesting, and he's been looking at it himself and wanted to point out that the verses mentioning Shetland in relation to Thorfinn have uncertain contexts. One appears in the confused chapter about Karl Hundason, and the content of the verses suggests they have nothing to do with the fight between Thorfinn and whoever Karl was. The other Shetland verse, usually included in Thorfinn's Draupa, only survives in Snorri's Edda. It is attributed to Arnor, but could refer to Rögnvald Brusason or Thorfinn. Therefore, it's possible to argue all verses referring to a Lord of Shetland were Rögnvald Brusason, not Thorfinn. This appears to help your argument about Brusi and Rögnvald further. So
It certainly did. I realised that I was when I attributed that final verse to Thorfinn, I had to do some contortions to date it to the end of his career. But thanks for that, Tom, and I'm pleased that you're continuing to do your excellent work on Orkneyinga Saga. Sounds good.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, and then we've got just a question from Maria Drago. Sorry if I've pronounced your name wrong, Maria. She's from the US and has enjoyed the talk, and she wonders if these sagas passed down from men to men only, or were women ever entrusted as bards of the communities? So we know that sagas are actually written, but perhaps the potential oral traditions that might underlie some of it. I'll leave that with you, Brian. I don't think we know, but there we go.
Well, I mean, we could speak about that all night. It's been the subject of huge amounts of controversy over the centuries, but I'm quite happy to imagine a Shetland woman sitting by the fireside reciting a tale or two.
And I'm sure they did. I just wondered if we could go back to the beginning of your talk when you mentioned Inch Ork and Inch Cat, and I just wondered if you could fill us in a little bit about why you think Inch Cat might be Caithness rather than Shetland.
Yeah, well, the first reason is that when it's a wee bit complicated, there's a 12th century source published by Skene in his the first volume of his Celtic Scotland, almost exactly the same period as the Kogad reference that I mentioned, where Caithness and Orkney are placed right next to each other as islands where Norway had control. The second reason is that when Earl Sigurd is mentioned in the Annals of Ulster, he's simply referred to as Sigurd of Ork. That's clearly Orkney. Nobody could have any doubt about that at all. It's difficult to me to see why Shetland need necessarily be mentioned at that point. I suspect that what would be mentioned at that point is something that the Irish people who read that text might be more likely to have heard of rather than poor Shetland. But I mean, the question is open. It is the case that Watson in 1926 is the only scholar that I know who definitely said that is Shetland. Skene said that is Caithness, and most other people, including you yourself, Andrew, in your excellent article about the etymology of the name Hjaltland, say that Inse Ork may well not be Shetland, and that's exactly where I'm coming from.
Thank you, Brian. And for those who might worry about a word Asia meaning island being applied to a mainland area, well, we have plenty of other examples of that. I just came across one yesterday where Kintyre was regarded as an island in I think it was a charter from Robert the Bruce. So, you know, it's not impossible for these things to happen. Well, I think unless there's any further questions, I think it just leaves it for me to wrap things up. And oh, hang on, there's another mention of Skeg. Certainly got the beards burning here. Hello, just a note on the word Skeggy. Skeggy means a man, and if someone wanted to insult someone, the word Tadskeglingur means someone who didn't grow a beard. Well, thank you very much, Anna. So, thank you very much indeed, Brian. Lots of food for thought. And again, it's just really interesting to hear Shetland being put in its sort of proper position within the earldom of Orkney. And it's important that everybody gets a chance to hear that. And yeah, thank you very much. And I hope to catch up with you sometime soon about other topics. So, And
Good,
everyone, remember to come to the next talks that we have for the Institute for Northern Studies. But thanks again, Brian.
Thank you.